now let me welcome the two teams who have progressed to the grand final out of, I think, 63 total teams that we had in this tournament this weekend. On government, we have Team China High School. And in opposition, we have Team FDT Red. I think you all know the rules by now. We'll have 8 minutes for constructive speeches, up to 4 minutes for reply speeches. Speakers, you have a microphone there for POIs. Please use it so that everyone in the hall can hear your question. The motion for the final is, assuming it was possible, this House would allow soldiers to take a pill at the end of their service that would cause them to forget their wartime experiences. Judges all got that? I will repeat it, okay. Assuming it was possible, this House would allow soldiers to take a pill at the end of their service that would cause them to forget their wartime experiences. Without any further ado, I'll let Servan take over.
So we'll be, for speakers, we'll be timing your speeches using debate keepers, so you kill this bell. Can you hear it?
Yeah.
All right, that's great. All right. So if everyone's ready, then without further ado, it's my pleasure to welcome the first speaker for proposition.
Can everyone hear me? Oh. Soldiers around the age of 18, which is approximately the age of both teams on this stage, are forced out of their homes. Their lives and the primes of their lives are taken away. But most crucially, this is not 2 years in military service, but a lifetime of trauma that results from the wartime experiences. Because during war, you see the blood of dead soldiers that you once trained with and stayed in military barracks with. You are forced to turn innocent people into mass murderers and to commit atrocities that they never thought they would commit in their lives. And you have regrets of not saving the soldier next to you when you thought you could have saved them. This is the experience of war, and wartime experiences are the direct result and stimulant of all the horrors that happen as a result of it. Because after war, you cannot look at yourself in the mirror because you see a mass murder. You wake up many times during the night because you have flashbacks of wars during your dreams, and you avoid any type of human interaction because human interaction is what spurs flashbacks. These are people that are prisoners of their own minds. But the biggest problem is that they're forgotten by governments and they are relegated to shadows of neglect. Because in states like the US, Korea, and large military states worldwide, veteran programs fail, and psychological programs are insufficient in addressing one of the largest humanitarian harms towards people's minds that we've seen in the world. What is our model? 2 parts. First, we will allow soldiers to have the choice to take this pill at any time after their military service. Secondly, note that this will happen to all soldiers who have committed never going back into war, because the emotion allows us to assume that this will happen to people who have committed not to going back to service as well. We're going to forward 2 arguments today. First, why it would be fundamentally cruel to withhold the use of this existing technology, and secondly, why we ensure better outcomes. Before that, I just want to briefly explain the alternatives we stand for on proposition. They might say that war experiences must be preserved because it allows people to speak up more vividly against war. We support 2 alternatives to this type of speech. First, we support media reporting on war. Any status quo, there are non-combatant media reporters that do things like investigative journalism and have photos and videos that provide vivid depictions of those horrors of war. The New York Times reporters, for example, put themselves into the captivity of Middle Eastern terrorist groups to understand the intricacies of wars, with agencies even paying ransom for those journalists' escape. Secondly, I want to characterize the people who will take this pill as it is a choice. People most affected by trauma on their side are least likely to speak up against war because they try to distance themselves from speaking up against the flashbacks that stimulated that post-traumatic stress disorder or PTSD that happened in the first place. These are people that will take the pill on either side of the house. But note also that trauma exists on a spectrum and affects war differently. So people who are patriotic and believe that these wars experiences are important to them will speak up anyway and choose not to take it. No, thank you. Japanese generals, for example, visited China after the Nanking massacre, saw the atrocities of it, and instead of having that trauma, decided to speak up against it. So I think these alternatives are largely mitigated on their side of the house. Now to my first argument, why it would be fundamentally cruel to withhold the use of this existing technology. I want to begin this argument by first characterizing the vastly unfair and coercive nature of military drafts worldwide. First of all, there are voluntary drafts in developed countries like the United States and the United Kingdom, which may seem voluntary and like a choice to enter that harm, but it disproportionately targets the poor because the poor are most vulnerable and see it as a form of employment. Secondly, developing countries who have a pressing need for soldiers often have mandatory conscription, no thank you, in places like Korea and Malaysia and Singapore that do not afford anyone a choice. The conclusion of this characterization is that people are forced into military service because of circumstances. Given that they are forced, what the state must do when they're extracting costs of citizens for utilitarian benefit when they have no other alternatives is to minimize the harm occurred towards these people that they're instrumentalizing. Before I move on, yes.
Isn't it easier for the government to justify conscription at a point when the public doesn't see the visceral emotional reactions of soldiers going through the atrocities of war?
Here's the thing. Again, we told you about media reporting, but the other thing to note is that there are still threats of going into war at the point of conscription. Because people know whether they're going to forget it from their memory or not, that during that moment they will still experience atrocities. Whether you don't have that experience of forgetting it is irrelevant to the thought calculus of people who choose to enter the military. Back to my point. We think that people in war still have dignity and are subject to human rights regulations, which is why we have doctrines like the Geneva Convention to protect them from war crimes. And they are more than instruments. That is why the state has an obligation to provide things like medics and hospitals during war. And note that this is unequivalent to just medical service because we want our soldiers to be better at fighting, but because they morally deserve it. The even more unjust thing on their side of the house is that when this technology is able to be assumed to be existing on both sides of the house, the governments are literally being negligent as a result of this. Because governments have this technology, and governments in places of war often develop their technology and distribute new forms of technology to give to war to minimize the crime. An analogy would be that this is tantamount to finding a cure to cancer that minimizes the symptoms, but you refuse to release that drug so people can more vividly speak up against this terrible disease. We think the bottom line of this argument is that it is immoral when this existing technology exists, that states already have medical infrastructure that they delegate, and to deny them of this technology is completely inhumane. Next argument as to why we minimize harm. I just want to point out that their side denies the dignity of civilians, because what they do subject them to is the current status quo of insufficient psychological treatments, where psychologists are unable to understand the nuances and experiences of war, and often wartime civilians do not want to exit their homes to get in touch with human civilization in terms of speaking to psychologists. The benefits on our side of the house are twofold when we change the insufficiency of the status quo. The first thing to say is that we make hundreds of thousands of lives better. Because recognize that in developed countries and developing countries worldwide, we're talking about millions of people who are subjected to conscription and the horrors of war as well. This is effective because the PTSD solution allows us to assume that this drug would be effective in alleviating those wartime experiences that we've characterized are the direct cause and the stimulant of war in the first place. But secondly, built-in alternatives are far less likely on their side of the house. Because in order to get some sort of efficacy and psychological treatments, what you need is large sums of political will and political capital for people to be able to fund veteran programs. Any status quo, we can't even get sufficient political will to fund welfare programs, let alone veteran programs as well. So their political will largely doesn't exist. We think that pills largely diminish that need for political will because it is easy just to give people a pill, make them swallow it, and reduce those experiences without having to pay large sums in psychological money on their side of the house. Instead, we think that political will is much better spent on reducing the harms of war. For example, building up military infrastructure so that people do not have to experience those traumatizing experiences in the first place. We minimize harm because we provide this instantaneous solution to the PTSD that otherwise would plague soldiers on their side of the house. We say in proposition that for too long, there has not been a solution to the post-traumatic stress disorder and the humanitarian harms that these people face. Because we minimize this harm, and because this is tantamount to inhumane oppression on their side of the house when governments do not use this technology, go inside proposition. Thank you.
The first speaker on the opposition bench.
Everyone hear me okay? Just because I forget what happened to me doesn't mean the trauma doesn't stick. Proposition hinges their case on the idea that if you forget your memories and forget your experiences and forget what happened to you and the harms that occurred, that you will no longer be traumatized by what happened. Recognize that they miss the psychological link of how individuals are still traumatized and still suffer from their memories and visions of how their abusers hurt them, even without the explicit memories of what exactly happened. On side opposition, we fight this characterization of being able to fix all of your problems by forgetting them, and we are fighting the characterization of what proposition says they are able to achieve with the pill we are so proud to be opposing today. Let's get some refutation out of the way before we get into our constructive case. So firstly, we fight this idea of the trauma being gone just because you forget your memories. And secondly, we fight the narrative of which people will be taking the pill. Because we don't think they engage with the actual principle on their side of the house. Because they told you that their principle is reliant on people being able to access the pill because it is available. Just because something is available doesn't mean that all individuals should access it. They never prove to you why it is necessary for individuals to access the pill, as long as they don't prove to you why trauma is gone at the point at which you forget your memories. Secondly, they assume the entire principle of their case as this access and this practical benefit. But they never prove to you the actual practical benefits of being able to take the pill in terms of correcting the trauma and all of the issues that occurred during the war. They also address the fact, through our POI, of the fact that individuals are now no longer able to advocate for all of the harms that actually occurred to them, and they're no longer able to remember what happened to them at the point at which they forget all of the atrocities that they have committed. They are able to somehow stand on the side where they are proposing an irresponsible military, an irresponsible government, and irresponsible accountability at the point at which individuals cannot stand up for what happened to them, and governments are less likely to care. Let's get into our constructive because it will clash quite nicely. Firstly, the illegitimate decision-making process. So firstly, we're going to talk about the permanency of this decision and how this is extremely harmful to these individuals. So under this, we want to characterize how this pill works, because we think they did a very irresponsible job of talking about this. They never told you how individuals are not able to properly gauge or understand what it means to change and alter your identity. Recognize that what makes you a person are your experiences and your memories.
Point.
Without those parts of yourself, you are unable to actually be the person you are. We think that if they're unable to engage with the fact that individuals will become fundamentally altered at the point at which these memories are gone, they're unable to win this debate. No thank you.
Point.
So, at the point at which there's no opt-out decision and a reversible process of this pill, we think individuals who are unable to gauge the concept of what they're going to be post taking this pill makes this decision irresponsible and illegitimate. Secondly,
Point.
No thank you. We think that why it's important to recognize why this decision-making is life-altering is that because these soldiers have had these particular experiences, there are specific individuals in society who are able to make different types of decisions, who are able to be different types of people in this society and benefit the society otherwise. When these individuals are now taken apart and no longer themselves, we think we lose a lot of the benefits of having these soldiers in the first place, having experienced this war, accepting the atrocities, however, recognizing that many of these wars also include aid, also include helping individuals who are in need, as well as humanitarian processes of what you do in war. No thank you. Secondly, coercion. We think even if these decisions were hypothetically hypothetically reversible, the process of deciding to take the pill is not fully consensual at the point at which the government, as well as the information that is lacking under their side of the house, is unavailable to these individuals who are likely to take the pill. So firstly, on the lack of information. We think that even if, as we told you before, the information is processed and given to them, that individuals can't gauge what it'll be like for them to no longer be themselves. But secondly, even if we say this information could be given to them correctly, no thank you, we think it's unlikely that governments are actually going to give this information for two reasons. Firstly, governments want to be able to take their country to war for political reasons, for other industrial and economic reasons. We think that at the point at which the government is able to create a bigger military with more disposable people, because these people now no longer remember their harms or have harms towards them, we think governments are much more likely to engage in these types of war. We'll talk about this more in our second point. But secondly, we think governments are likely to coerce individuals due to these reasons, and once again, this makes this decision process illegitimate. So what we prove through this point is that, one, this principled idea of individuals being able to access the pill just based on the fact of its availability is not enough for them to win this debate. But secondly, we told you why it's an illegitimate decision at the point at which individuals cannot gauge the actual impacts of taking this pill. So second point now on the accountability of governments. Firstly, setting context of how governments choose to go to war. We already told you governments like to engage in war for political reasons, imperialistic reasons in developed nations, no thank you, and even in developing nations, these social and religious reasons. There are just a lot of reasons why governments want to engage in war. So why is it bad when more war happens? Well, we obviously think that war harms people and individuals, but insofar as we can prove that the government is more inclined to now go to war because of this addition and this influx of individuals who want to join the war, we'll be analyzing this further, is this idea of that when they seem disposable, because it seems like these soldiers will not be harmed, there's no longer this sacrifice to the country, we think it is likely that these governments will engage in more war. So second idea under this is that this lack of exposure of these atrocities to individuals within this stage will harm the process as well as create more war. Before I get into that, sure.
Wartime experiences and trauma are a direct result of the memories of war that people have that we assume feasibility that we can eliminate. How then is PTSD something that you can, PTSD is also something you cannot opt out of?
Thank you. Okay. Firstly, my second speaker has a third point all about mental illness, but quickly to just answer that, we're telling you that essentially many people will create defense mechanisms in which they block out memories. At the point at which they block out memories and are still unable to understand why their trauma exists and why they're still in this traumatic, still experiencing traumatic visions and these types of flashbacks, we think they're unable to prove that the memory and the trauma have a link. Secondly, into our idea of the less exposure to atrocities. Firstly, when you remove the people who are experiencing war firsthand, as in our POI when we asked them, these individuals are no longer able to advocate, they responded with media. Okay, there is a trade-off here. The media can still exist under our side of the house. However, when you lose the individuals who experience this firsthand, those individuals who know exactly what it feels like to be in the moment and having experienced those issues and atrocities, no thank you, we think these individuals are the ones removed from the conversation, and these are the ones that we need the most in society for multiple reasons that we'll get into. So firstly, we think that when people are able to understand the full process of this war, are unable to do that under their side of the house. And this is why you have this bigger military that becomes more disposable, that leads to politicians as well as governments just deciding that war is more easily engaged in. But firstly, we wanted to tell you why war is generally just unjust and unnecessary. But even if war is sometimes just, this allows for more unnecessary war to happen at the point of which there is the ability of losing soldiers and losing lives of your country is thrown away because you think that soldiers will not be harmed. Secondly, even if in the case of just war, we think more atrocities and worse ones will occur at the point in which the soldiers who committed these atrocities no longer are feeling guilty or have any accountability to these situations because they don't remember that they happened. So why is this? We tell you about the post-war justice process. So the court-martial process is in a way where soldiers are able to talk about their experiences and bring these atrocities up so that they can bring up justice for these wars or for any atrocities that were committed. At the point at which these soldiers are taken out of the context and taken out of the conversation, there's literally no evidence left in these court-martials to prove anything wrong. How is this harmful to all of these individuals? Firstly, you are more able to create repeat abusers. That is the politicians who are able to choose to go to these wars, as well as those individuals who choose to commit huge atrocities. Also, you hurt the soldiers and you hurt the victims of these wars, all of the individuals that you're choosing to engage in war with. At the end of the day, our side of the house proves that there's an illegitimate decision-making process, and there are incredible harm to soldiers that they're unable to engage with. We're so proud to have opposed.
Is this good? In the late 20th century, the American CIA engaged in an operation known as MKUltra. They took innocent civilians, performed inhumane tests on them, and then left them in the streets to suffer. Those people were left with permanent trauma, they were left with mental illness, and they were left with debilitating physical conditions. Regardless of whether or not MKUltra in and of itself was justified, we still say that the government had an obligation to help those people, to provide them medical services afterward, and to save them as best possible. We say that whether or not the government is justified in taking 2 years of your life, it is certainly not justified in taking the rest of your life along with it. We were happy to stand with that under this side of the debate. I want to ask 3 questions in this speech. Firstly, what is the principal justification of their grounds and ours? Secondly, how do we better impact political change, and is that justified in the first place? And thirdly, my new substantive on how this causes better integration and how that shapes the social fabrics of these areas. So, first, let's talk about the principal justification of this debate. What we heard from them is that all of our principle falls because PTSD is not triggered by memories. Here's the thing. We told you from the first speech very clearly that it is, because these memories are flashbacks. They come to you in moments where you remember what happened on the battlefield, when you remember your fellow soldier being draped over your soldier, bleeding out onto you, when you remember someone that you know and love dearly being lost. These are moments that you remember and you take along with you and cause the trauma that we talked about on their side of the house. This trauma is triggered by memory, and that's why it was important that they ignored the analysis by Linden, where we said that this was the stimulant and cause of trauma. But even to the extent that it does not fix this trauma entirely, to the degree that it fixes it to some degree, we say that individuals should have the choice to make the decision for themselves that yes, I want to ameliorate my pain, yes, I want to lessen this right now. So what is the principle? We told you it is analogous to not addressing the wounds of soldiers on the battlefield. Why? Because if you are not helping them just because it's not the best way, or just because you want to use them to gain political action in the future, we would say that's generally immoral for 2 reasons. Firstly, you need to minimize the harm to soldiers, right? Governments act to protect the interests of their civilians, and even in wartime, we say this still applies. So, even if you're conscripting an individual, you want to minimize the harm to them, which is presumably why we take soldiers and heal them, even if they were injured on the battlefield, even if they're not as useful to us anymore. But secondly, this impact is amplified because there is an extractive relationship between the state and the individual in this instance. That is to say that the state takes away your ability to opt out in the military in many cases. It asks you to do this incredibly onerous task and asks you to take on all the harms of the military. Given that, we say that the state has a greater obligation to you to protect your rights. Now note, soldiers are not just bodies on the ground for the government to optimize for strategic use. So even if they argue on a practical level that this may be better for the military, then it's still not justified. We allow them to take this pill. We give them that choice. What did we hear in response to the principle? They said this is an illegitimate decision for basically 2 reasons. Firstly, because it fundamentally alters you, and secondly, because you don't have perfect information. Firstly, on fundamentally altering you, yes, we agree. This is a good fundamental alteration of your life. They never characterized to us why the fact that you may be delivering aid outweighs the fact that you also saw people dying, also saw people traumatized. If you assess it for yourself to be a good impact in your life, then we think that is ultimately justified. They critique the lack of opting out. We would say that the inability to opt out from not remembering things is better than the inability to opt out from PTSD on their side of the house. But also, in regard to not having perfect information, we never have perfect information. They never told us why this information was so necessary or what information you were lacking. If anything, we would say it's a justified choice. Because let's assume they gave us a better argument here. Let's assume that they say these soldiers are making a decision under duress. But the problem is, people can make important decisions for themselves under duress all the time. For example, if I was involved in a car accident and I needed to amputate my leg, my doctor would still allow me to make that decision even if I was under extreme pain. We would say this is such an important decision, we need to give people this right. Next, let's talk about policy outcomes and social outcomes. The first thing they said is that this justifies conscription, mostly explained through the POI, not really explained in the last speaker. We have 2 responses. Firstly, this misunderstands the opposition to conscription. That is to say, veterans are not heard opposing conscription because very often, as we told you, veterans have very little political voice. Veterans do not have the ability for society to listen to them. Rather, it is these scared parents of the 18-year-olds who would be going into the military who who would still be going in on either side of the house. So presumably, the fact that you erase trauma at the end of service does not change the fact that it will still harm your 18-year-old, you will still rally equally hard. But even if they get this benefit on their side of the house, that they get slightly less conscription, we would say it's immoral to use these individuals as social battering rams, right? That is to say that it's highly unintuitive to say conscription is bad, so we are going to make everyone in war worse off, because presumably what they want to prevent is the harms of war. We say that a major harm of war is this trauma. Next, they said, oh, this means that you can't stop war as much. I have 6 responses for the first time in my life. But the first thing I want to know is that this is about the end of service. So if they're going to talk about soldiers that can be used like freely on their side of the house, that's probably not who we're talking about. They're probably talking about lobbying. But 6 responses. Firstly, it's not clear why we need this at all. That is to say that governments around the world, especially the developed countries that they talked about, are increasingly turning inward, increasingly saying that I do not want to use soldiers as much as possible for the very reasons that I talked about earlier, because parents don't want their 18-year-olds to be going off to war. Secondly, the media. And we would note that the media is even more effective than these veterans at reporting on war. Why? For the simple reason that the media can actually share the experiences of war more vividly than veterans often can, because veterans are scared of sharing their experiences, and because media can transmit things like photos and quotes, something that they are literally there to do. Thirdly, that these people are not likely to be good activists in either case, because you want to avoid trauma and flashbacks at all costs if you are a person that has PTSD, which means that you are unlikely to be a protester. Fourth, that there's the signal that these pills send that tells people this is so bad that 80% of the people in the military want to take a pill. That is a message that's very loud to the public. Fifth, we allow activists that really care, like the whistleblowers that Lyndon talked about, like Chelsea Manning, to not take the pill, to advocate on their own behalf, but crucially, it is their choice. And sixthly, that this is a minimal impact, if anything, because if anything, it might expedite a war by maybe 10 days, but we say that we save 10,000 soldiers on our side of the house. That's much, much better on our side. The final thing that I want to talk about is better integration. This is a fairly intuitive point. There is a lack of ability to find stability as a result of a wartime trauma. That means that since veterans associations are very weak and not protecting these people, it's hard to find a job, because very often you are affected in your ability to work adequately. Secondly, it's hard to find a home, hard to find the stability that comes with being warm at night. Thirdly, it means it's harder to socialize with other individuals. And note, these people feel like outsiders as a result. What is the impact? 3 main groups. Firstly, disaffected communities in war-torn areas like we see in the Middle East right now. That means that these people walk out of war, feel disaffected, and often have to turn to terrorist groups or criminal syndicates that often seem like the best alternative and accept them better. Secondly, the warmongering individuals like we see in Israel that walk out of the military and feel like the military was the only one that represented them. Thirdly, the mercenary groups such as paramilitias in Brazilian favelas that go around harassing individuals. And note, this is not just individuals, this is a huge societal group. At the end of this debate, there is a principled right of these individuals to minimize the harm to them. They strip that away. We are incredibly proud to propose.
From the couple months I took AP Psychology this year, the most important thing I learned is that oftentimes mental illnesses such as PTSD, depression, and anxiety isn't purely triggered by the memory, but in fact it is triggered by the trauma and the impact those memories have upon you. This is why within the current status quo, some type of defense mechanism, for example, people actively forgetting memories that may be traumatic to them, still suffer from things such as PTSD, depression, anxiety. We think there is a mischaracterization about the actual cause of these mental illnesses on their side of the house, and for this reason, I'm so proud to oppose. 2 things for you as your second opposition speaker. Number 1, refutation and reconstruction on everything we have heard from their side of the house. And lastly, our third point on the idea of exactly the mental health of soldiers and why they exactly worsens it. First of all, refutation. First point I hold problem is with their alternative that the first speakers have brought up. There are 4 structural reasons why those alternatives will not work. Number 1, they talk about media reports. First of all, we believe that oftentimes these media reports, such as investigative journalism, wouldn't go into depth. They won't go look at the very personal impacts that these wars have on individuals, the impacts that these soldiers can show. Second of all, we think that they're oftentimes not even allowed on media to go into the most atrocious areas and show it on TV, because that's just simply sometimes confidential, and also just not allowed to show on media those very graphic images. They don't get the same benefits on their side of the house. But furthermore, at best, under their side, even if there is a certain amount of criticism, the criticism that they get under their side is significantly less than the criticism these soldiers can show as well. But moreover, recognize that this alternative of media exists only in developed countries and those war, because in the best case scenario, the only developed country and countries that are not corrupt will allow media to show this to their citizens. Developing countries and countries that are very unstable and going to war, and for example Iraq or Syria, in which they attack their own citizens, will never allow the media to show this. The only way we can actually bring these things to attention is with soldiers who can actually speak out against the states after they have served. Not at this moment. Second of all, they talked about, well, we still have people who won't take these pills and they will become these like social activists. However, under their side of the house, these people are the minority of cases. My first speaker already gave you structural reasons in which these people are likely to be coerced into taking these pills, as in there's probably going to be a social pressure for them to take these pills, and there's no alternative for medical treatment. I'm going to explain that later in my speech. So what that means is that the few people who still have the memories ingrained in them are very delegitimized to the extent there's not many people who support what they say is actually truthful, and recognize that media oftentimes also have their own biases. The actual images that the media portray upon like what war is actually like may not even be truthful in the first place because of those exact biases. Okay, first point under their side of the house, this is cruel to hold the use of this text, use of this technology. 2 responses. Number 1, this is contingent on the practical outcome. We already explained to you why mental illness isn't exactly just like treated with erasing memory. And second of all, we will say that under their side of the house, they actually make it more dangerous for these soldiers. For instance, if these soldiers are less likely to admit for the war crimes, we're more likely to let people in Syria or those countries become more extremist, and in turn harm those soldiers on a practical level. And second of all, we think that under their side of the house, this is a justification to the mechanism that are very morally ambiguous to take in more soldiers into the army and send more soldiers into the war, because now you create this veneer that like these soldiers are not even that harmed by war in the first place. Second point they brought you is the access to treatment. We have 2 responses to that. Number 1, we reject the idea that political will doesn't really exist under our side of the house. We think many times in like most societies, soldiers are respected members of the society, so we can in fact very much improve the funding of these programs that helps veterans deal with them. But under their side of the house, they will have so much less voice to the extent in which people believe this pill is going to be the solution that solves everything, and that removes the political will that will still benefit the soldiers and that will not be benefited by this technology. Second of all, at best, they only have partial mitigation to the burden of the soldier on a mental level. We will say that under their side of the house, to the extent where they cause us more war and cause this country to actually send an army, what does this cause? This causes death of innocent families, and this also causes more soldiers that would be impacted by this exact mental burden. Sure.
Even if we accept your characterization that memories are only partially the cause of trauma, isn't it comparatively better to get some benefit and some treatment rather than nothing on your side of the house?
I'm going to explain why that why that some treatment doesn't exist in my third point, and I will flag that later. Okay. The third point was this idea about better integration. In the 1 minute that he used to analyze this point, I just got this idea, well, they will become actual productive member of society. Recognize we have already refuted that point to the extent in which we explained that practical benefits does not exist. Okay, onto our last point on the idea of the mental health of soldiers. So, first of all, we'd just like to recognize that oftentimes getting rid of the memories doesn't equate to getting rid of the actual mental impacts or the mental illnesses. We think that mental illness in and of itself is an illness. It doesn't just go away through like taking away the memory, and we think that people oftentimes conditionally hold on to it. We will give you the example of the status quo, in which human
body and the human mind have this defense mechanism in which at times when you experience extreme trauma, your brain actually removes that memory from yourself, but yet those individuals who removes that memory, their brain actively does that, still experiences a trauma. Because it is not the memory that triggers a trauma, but rather the impact it had upon your mental state and upon your brain. Okay, second of all, this practically proves that erasing the memory is really ineffective on their side of the house. But the second subpoint is extremely important. Why is it worse on their side of the house? Why is treatment for mental illnesses going to be worse? Number one, it will become the norm for soldiers to take this pill because of two reasons. Number one, people will assume that taking this pill is going to solve the issues to the extent in which even if it doesn't actually solve like the actual mental illness, then these soldiers are less likely to call out on the memory that caused those illnesses, so people will believe, well, it's going to be solved. Meaning that the programs that we have currently and can be improved upon under our side of the house doesn't get any political will or funding because people believe this is not an issue anymore within our country. Second of all, it illegitimizes mental illnesses of those who do not take the pill. Because on their side, they will believe this is going to be a blanket solution, and if an individual does not take this pill and traumatic memories still exist, then people are just going to say, we're not going to offer you any other treatments, therapeutical or not, because you have the choice of using the treatment we provided with you, which is this very ineffective way of taking this pill that erases the memory, right? Second of all, even if this processes of therapy is still funded and even better funded on their side of the house, why is this likely to be ineffective? Because oftentimes, in order for individuals to overcome those traumatic events and things such as PTSD, they need to target the memory and overcome the memory in on itself. On their side, if those individuals don't even know what is causing those traumatic events, how are they supposed to overcome the memory on their side? What is the impact? The impact is number one. We cause the society to think that the issues that impacts the veterans are solved when it is not, and we also proven to you why on their side they make all the harms much worse because now they don't have access to the therapy that actually is effective under our side. Very proud to oppose.
The problem with opposition is they've been very reluctant to engage in what the world looks like on their side of the house. Because contrary to what they say, people don't just take PTSD and live with it. They resort to alcoholism. They resort to drug addictions to try to drown out the pain. Because as they've been silent of what they support, the subtext is clear. They support a status quo where ultimately treatments by government is insufficient, where veterans don't get the treatment they need, and they are left far worse as alcoholics and people on the streets who are begging for money. I have 3 points of contention. Firstly, is it principally justified? Secondly, how do we help politics? And finally, how do we better help victims of war? So first, I just want to talk about the idea of the model. Because assuming this motion in the very first words say, we have the technology to change this, we assume that's what the debate is about. But ultimately, we think that it's not enough for them to say people still have trauma, because the memory is often the root cause of trauma. The exemplification and portrayal of trauma is flashbacks that are clear in your memory, right? Their response to this was, but soldiers try to block out memories a lot of the times and it doesn't work. There's a difference between trying to suppress a memory and actually erasing the memory on our side of the house, right? But secondly, if all their analysis is true, it is also destructive to their own case. Because if people are still plagued by trauma on our side of the house, then they lose every one of the benefits they want to claim. So just note the huge contradiction that they have to resolve in the next 2 speakers, although it's probably a bit too late anyways. So first question, therefore, let us talk about the idea of the principle. Because we were very clear that on our side of the house, you had to understand the context of military service. It was already highly coercive. In fact, there were things like the poverty draft, like forced conscription, that all meant you were forced into the military, and ultimately that meant there was a reciprocal duty. What were their responses? The first one was the idea of permanence. We told you that you have to weigh what is more permanent. The permanence on our side of the house, where you forget the memories, or the permanence of PTSD and trauma that exists on their side of the house, because that is equally permanent. But secondly, permanent decisions are not illegitimate, and they never showed us why. To a certain extent, every choice an individual makes in their lives is irrevocable in nature. And we said on our side of the house, it was a good permanent alteration, in the same way education is a good permanent alteration. But secondly, they said, but there's not enough information, therefore it's coercion, right? Firstly, we said that even if there's not perfect information, people are still legitimate in making the choice. Because if you buy into their principle, people don't have perfect information for anything, like even having a child. So you probably restrict that on their side too. But more importantly, all the analysis is equally symmetric, because people don't go into war with perfect information of how they're going to come out, how they're going to feel, or whether or not they'll even make it alive, right? But secondly, we told you that maybe coercion may exist to a certain extent on our side of the house. But you have to compare that to all the structural forces of coercion we laid out in PM, the forces of coercion that force people into the military. We told you that at least on our side of the house, the coercion we have is working in a countervailing manner to all the forces that force people into these areas. But most importantly of all, they never responded to the idea of negligence. The fact that if you have the treatment and the capability to cure someone, and you withhold that, that is negligent in the same way that you deprive people of medical treatment when you readily can treat them. Their response to this was, it's based on feasibility. Look, we said even if the treatment's not perfect on our side of the house, it's still comparatively better than on their side of the house. No response to any of that. Second question, let's talk about politics and what they said in response to the reasons we gave you about how we get politics and all these other things far better. We told you about things like media. Their response was, media doesn't really look at personal interests. I would like to contest that, given that the New York Times literally won the Pulitzer Prize last year, interviewing and having a co-ed about someone who was suffering from PTSD, right? Like, that's simply not true, right? But then they tried to move this debate into developing nations, where media would be censored. Presumably, if media is censored, then the voices of these veterans in complaint against the government would also be censored. So I think that a lot of your analysis also destroys your own case, right? But then finally, they rested on this idea that criticism is most effective when it comes from the soldiers' voices. Unresponsive to the analysis we gave you in first. The reason why advocacy never comes from veterans with PTSD is because these people are highly traumatized and distance themselves from triggers. So protesting on the streets about your experiences is something that's very likely to trigger that flashback and to trigger that trauma. Oftentimes, the vast majority of soldiers recluse themselves, they distance themselves and avoid any type of interaction with the memories that they've had. But finally, we told you about the idea of the symbolic significance. That if war is so bad on their side of the house, the fact that 80 to 90% of the people who go into war taking this pill is hugely important, because these statistics tell the world how bad war really is. Finally, they narrowed their case to the idea of how war crimes are far more likely to occur. Here's the problem. They never explained to us who was actually likely to commit war crimes. Because people don't just say, oh, I'm going to commit a war crime now because I'm going to forget about it. Because your opposition to killing someone is that is against your basic humanity, right? So people on their side of the house who commit war crimes are people who likely disrespect the humanity and don't believe in that of other people. That doesn't change. But more importantly, the promise of forgetting you committing a war crime is not enough to make sure that you don't commit that war crime. The reason why is because the experience is still horrible. And this is crucially important to all the ideas about conscription. Because oftentimes, the people who protest against conscription are parents who believe they don't want their son to die, who believe they don't want their son to go through that trauma. And all that means that there's a huge analogy here. That just because you might forget something doesn't mean it's good enough to inflict huge pains during the times which you remember it. No response to any of that. And finally, ultimately, what they did improve, if we accepted all of their analysis, was how effective protesting really was. Because protesting, in the vast majority of instances, is far too late. Note the fact that we literally had hundreds of thousands of people dead before protests had any real impact on the Vietnam War in America. What this crucially means is the protests you get are far more retrospective, far too late, and don't account for the weighing of rights of the people on our side of the house. Because we told you, people were instruments of the state. They were people who had the fundamental dignity and rights of any other person in society and should never be social battering rams that you force towards some state agenda. So finally, let's talk about the plight of these people. Because Matt told you in extension how on our side of the house, we provide the opportunity for these people to live their lives for the very first time. We allow them the possibility of integration for the very first time. All of their response was, well, you delegitimize people who keep this memory, right? Firstly, we think that we still stated in our model you can take the pill any time after. But secondly, We told you in Lyndon's speech how political capital gets far better on our side of the house. Psychological treatment is far more concentrated when there are less people who need that treatment. Because what they failed to understand was, if you support the status quo, that is a status quo that doesn't recognize veterans except for on one day every year. It is a side that structurally denies veterans the pensions that they were promised. It was a side that leaves them to become alcoholics with very little chance of ever integrating properly into society. So we think it's simply disingenuous for them to say soldiers are respected. Because even if they are respected, no one is willing to pool in that money, no one is willing to campaign on behalf of these people because they're such a small minority and people don't care. We told you at our side of the house, we truly care for these individuals, that their experiences matter and the opinions of them matter. Because the choice that we offered them was a choice to escape every other coercive factor in their life. The factors that pressure them to die, to suffer, and to never be able to have a good life. For these reasons, proud to propose.
Three themes in his speech. One, soldiers. Here I will address the crux of their case about how they will remove trauma and benefit the soldiers who have went to war. Secondly, war, and then here I'll reiterate the plethora of harms that were pointed to in our case about the innocent people in war zones who are likely to be harmed even more under their side of the house because of increased intervention and atrocities. Thirdly, I'll talk about the right to consume the pill. Firstly, before that, one piece of strategic thing I want to point out. Proposition largely based their case in a very US and Western world context, ignoring the fact that oftentimes governments can be coercive and abusive in developing countries, that you allow the Iraqi government to use coercive and abusive measures to have their soldiers take these pills, to forget about the raids and assaults in Kurdistan. We think that oftentimes the accountability measures and alternatives they suggest doesn't work everywhere, but even if it were to work, even based in largely in developed world context, I will engage with that as well. First thing in terms of soldiers, and here I'll deal with the most critical argument, which is that you remove memories from these individuals and you stop flashbacks and you allow these individuals to not go through these trauma again. Few things to note here. One, even to the extent that we can take away these memories, this trauma will still exist. Because even a proposition tells you that this technology can remove this memory, that's something they can fiat, but they can't fiat the fact that removing this memory will necessarily lead to no more trauma and no more PTSD. The reason why they'll still likely occur is that things that mimic the things that happen in war. So for example, if you're a soldier who have been to war and you heard a very loud banging sound, that can still cause trauma and severe harm to you, even though you might not know what's the cause of that and the memory that's causing that trauma to begin with. The second thing to note is that even if we were to concede that they get a short-term benefit to these individuals, in the sense that they get a partial mitigation of these harm and stopping these trauma, Jason told you very clearly in his third argument that oftentimes to deal with these trauma and to help these individuals in the long term, you need to be able to identify the cause of these trauma and the memories and be able to overcome them, to be able to adjust your life and be able to live with it. Because these things will never ever stop. Trauma and PTSD is something that lives with you for the rest of your life as they can see. And we say that even if there's short-term harm in terms of we not get the partial mitigation, being able to deal with it, especially with the increased veteran service and better funding that we support, is likely to help these individuals as well. They say if these individuals don't face trauma, then we contradict ourselves. That is not true, given that people who will likely sympathize with soldiers and the trauma that they go through, especially when they hear what atrocity they have to face, this will lead to increased funding, increased services that allows these individuals to better deal with the very problem that they want to talk about. Now, before I go into my second theme about wars, no thank you, I want to do a clear weighing here. Because it is quite clear at this point in the debate that what they stand on is on benefits and preventing harm to these soldiers, while what we stand on is about increased criticism of war and exposure of atrocities to help these individuals. What are the ways in which this comparatively we are better? One, we think that ultimately a trade-off ought to exist in terms of government priority and a fulfillment of obligation to either their soldiers or their innocent individuals. At best, under their side, they get partial mitigation for soldiers who have opted into a war in the first place. Now they want to say, but sometimes these can be coercive measures, and oftentimes soldiers cannot even opt out. This is a problem with the process in which people join in a war. It is unclear why the solution will solve that problem. We see a more sensible solution is to likely oppose industrial war, perhaps making the process of joining war much more transparent. The second thing to note is that the very soldier, no thank you, will be very harmed more even under their side of the house. Because as Allison and Jason told you, if it's a case that more people join war because they think it's like G.I. Joe and they don't hear about the massive atrocities that you might face when you have to shoot down a barrel and shoot at an innocent child because of child soldiers that you face. These times, often things you may get physically harmed as more people join more work under their side of the house. The fact that the people are, unable to talk about the memories and trauma they faced in court that gets justice for soldiers who have been abused and victims who have been abused. But lastly, the fact that other innocent other people, even if it's a case that they don't achieve these type of harm, people don't speak out. The fact is, when you create a perceptional effect that people can forget about these memories, people no longer talk about it anymore. People from other countries, individuals who are people in terrorist groups and radicals perceive as the United States and the people who are fighting them are not taking acknowledgement and responsibility for the very abuses that they have committed. So there are more individuals who are more likely to be radicalized under their side of the house and commit even more harm to the very people they want to talk about. So even though, even though they get partial mitigation of the harm that they're trying to prevent, the fact that you lead to more actual physical harm to innocent people and soldiers means that comparatively, our impacts are far more significant. Second theme,
Point.
War. No, thank you. And here I'm going to deal with the plethora of alternatives that they give you as to why the criticism can still occur under their side. They firstly talk about the media. 3 things to note here. 1, oftentimes media are just restricted from reporting on the worst atrocities in the first place. 2, oftentimes the media themselves do not have an incentive to report on these wars, given political party biases, and they themselves also involved in the military-industrial complex to join these wars. They say, but if it's a case that these media won't report on it, then they will silence the veterans anyway. But even if that's the case, the fact that these veterans still have these memories and can tell their friends, tell their families, and be able to mourn with other people is still a way in which these atrocities can be heard and can be spread out. No, okay. So the next thing is that they say, but people who want to speak out will speak out anyway. For that, yes.
So here's the issue. Your entire case is based on the contingency that these people are very eager to speak out after they come back from war. If you say that these triggers are so strong, and as we say, that causes aversion, why would they ever speak out on your side?
So the reason why is because even if individuals accept the fact that facing these type of trauma after war is a significant harm to them, oftentimes these individuals care more about the fact that they want to prevent other soldiers from joining war, prevent other people from facing the very same trauma, so there's no incentive, even if they have endured this incredible mental trauma, for them to speak out anyways. They say that people who want to speak out will speak out anyways and will just choose not to take the pill under their side of the house. But they ignore the fact of the other coercive measures under which the governments and other individuals can manipulate the conditions in which people take these pills. So the process in which people decide to take these pills is often coercive as well. But even if we accept all their alternatives as true about the media, about people speaking out, if all these things exist, these are the things that still exist under their side of the house. So the existence of alternatives for criticism of war is not something to be questioned, but the degree to which that criticism happens significantly decreases, given that you don't have these soldiers who can talk about the visceral experiences anymore. So no matter what, you have to accept that to a certain extent, they may have less talking about these type of worst things that happen in war. This leads to the type of harms that we talked about increased radicalization, harming other individuals, more atrocities in war that harms the innocent Iraqi families who owe a larger obligation to. Lastly, in terms of the principle, and note, even if we lose on a principle, even if these individuals have a right to consume these pills, this isn't necessarily a beneficial thing, and ultimately, if it harms other people's right to exist in a safe world, and it harms other soldiers' right to exist, to live their life safely without trauma, we think that that is a larger principal obligation in terms of fulfillment of their rights. They say that oftentimes, they say it's unjustified to sacrifice these individuals and use them as social battering them, but they choose to join the war. And even to an extent that other coercive measures exist, we told you that it's more sensible to address these other problems to make sure that the process in which people join war is transparent, it has reversible, and people can do it in a fully consensual manner. They say this is equitable to negligence, to not giving you medical treatment. But this is different, given that giving you medical treatment and harming someone is a definite benefit that will help you, while removing memories has other externalities of the increased war, atrocities, and intervention that harm other people. Even if they help soldiers and partially mitigate their harms, this is about the very innocent people and soldiers who will be fully harmed as more wars and atrocities happen. Thank you.
Today's proposition decided to rest their case on improving the lives of soldiers. Not only was this an illegitimate way to prove their case, they lacked engagement with all of the harms they create for all of society that we talked about, as well as the harms for soldiers and the process of making lives for soldiers better in the future. Let's get into the final questions to crystallize this debate. Firstly, do they improve veterans' lives? And secondly, do they still have accountability in their governments? So firstly, on veterans' lives, we think this idea of trauma has been thrown around in this debate very often, right? We told you that trauma in itself is not going to be fixed at the point at which you are unable to locate the problem. They told you that the removal of these memories is enough to ensure that you don't have trauma anymore. Recognize, Mr. Speaker, the nuanced analysis of what we told you is that therapy is circled around finding the solution to the specific memory of which the trauma was created. At the point at which that memory is literally gone and you cannot find what it is that makes you feel so abused in your life and feel that you have so many issues with your life and unable to operate in the sense that you're unable to move on, you're unable to solve any of those problems under their side of the house when you're unable to literally understand why it is that you feel so abused. Secondly, they never engage with all of the stuff we told you about how soldiers' lives in the future will become worse under their side of the house at the point at which they lose all advocacy and lose the collective amount of their voices. Because at the point at which, sure, they tell you that most soldiers don't want to speak up. We told you why this is illegitimate and how even if there are few soldiers who speak up, they're the most legitimate speakers, they're the most legitimate advocates for their cause. We told you why when you remove them from the conversation, you are losing the most impacted person in this debate or in this conversation, and these individuals are the ones most crucial to finding policies that are going to further advocate for them and further benefit them. In the future, they're going to create a less accountable government that is less accountable towards their militaries and less accountable to the treatment of their veterans and their soldiers. But second idea, do they still have accountability in their governments? And I think the reason this is so important is that much of our case talks about how the lack of accountability in government is going to result in more war, which is not only going to hurt millions of civilians, but also all of the soldiers that they care about protecting. They never actually engage with a lot of the analysis that we brought to you, and this is why we think they have ultimately lost this debate. Because firstly, they don't engage with the fact that the idea, how soldiers becoming seemingly more disposable to these governments is extremely harmful to the concept of going to more war and creating more atrocities that are going to become less accountable in the point at which there is no advocacy in terms of fighting that type of ideal. But secondly, they don't respond to the increasing reasons for engaging with war, because the only thing they tell you is that parents are still going to care about their children dying. We tell you that parents still exist on our side of the house, but also that parents are the least legitimate actor in this debate at the point in which they're the ones who don't understand all of the full impacts of these soldiers. Why is it they never justify it's okay to take soldiers out of the conversation that circles purely around them? But lastly, we don't understand how their side of the house thinks that they have won this debate at the point at which they think that this legitimate decision of being able to opt out of your memories and pretend that nothing ever happened to you in order to and in the praise of saying that you're going to be able to relieve yourself from trauma. At the end of the day, Mr. Speaker, recognize two things. Under their side of the house, the lives of soldiers become worse at the point at which they are literally unable to determine why it is that they can't move on from the atrocities that they had to commit in war. Secondly, because of the fact that they never engage with all of the analysis we gave you on why veterans' lives becoming worse and soldiers' lives becoming worse worsen the government accountability, worsen the accountability towards policies that help soldiers, and worsen the overall climate of the global sphere at the point at which individuals are unable to be safe from these individuals and these unaccountable governments. We are so proud to have won this debate.
Thank you for the fine speech. And now for the final speech of the debate, it's my pleasure to welcome the proposition.
Veterans are not a powerful social force, as they asserted on third. Aside from ex-convicts, they are the most likely group in the United States to end up homeless, to end up alcoholic, and to end up devolving into poverty. We say that that is not a group that they should champion on their side of the house. We better these lives, that's why we took this debate. I'm going to talk about two things. Firstly, Is it unjust for the government to withhold these pills? Secondly, what are the social outcomes? Firstly, it is unjust. Why? They created a feasibility attack, which they assumed was analysis, but really was pseudo-AP Psych. We would say that their third speaker and reply gave them away when they say, it's the memory that triggers this, even if you can't find the memory. Because the point isn't that you are just like hiding the memory somewhere. We told you it's that you are taking the memory away permanently. So if that is the source of the trauma, as they agree is the trigger, then we take that away, we win that. But even if that's not true, even if they're never going to be quite the same, if the soldier makes this choice for themselves that they don't want to vividly remember the wounds and scars that they saw in war, we think that's justified. A soldier that comes back with a prosthetic leg will never quite be the same. That does not mean we do not give them the prosthetic. But also, we told you that the government has an obligation to provide this. It is about choice. And no, this is not a contingent argument on impacts. Why? Because if every single soldier came back with crippling physical wounds, as we told you from first and second, that would probably be a little bit more efficacious under their analysis. That would probably save a bit of money for the military. But we would still say that that is ultimately unjust, that is ultimately cruel, and we cannot treat our civilians and our soldiers that way. We don't see why it's different just because there is a mental and psychological harm rather than a physical harm. They clearly lost on that point. They then said it's different because it's permanent and coercive. We asked, which condition is better? Forgetting some aid work you might have done, or having PTSD that is traumatizing you, vividly remembering those things every morning you wake up, every time, as they say, you hear a loud bang. We think that's much worse. But they never actually explained the coercion. So even if there was coercive force, we were unable to assess the degree to which that impacted individuals. We say that people can still make the choice for themselves, like you make that choice after a car accident of getting surgery. Next, on social outcomes. Their main claim, and this is where they hinge their entire case, is that they decrease conscription and war. The first thing that we told you is that short-termist incentives still exist and are much, much greater than long-termist incentives, because the visceral fear of going to war and the visceral fear of losing all these things that we talked about are the most important thing in most people's impact calculus. But they didn't respond to the alternatives that we gave you, that most countries already limit this, that the media is able to report on this better than soldiers are because they have photos, because they have interviews, because they are on the battlefield themselves. Their response to that was, governments are hawkish, they will prevent the media from reporting. The issue is that soldiers would also be prevented from speaking openly. Telling 3 people is not going to help you. But also, soldiers will not be talking, because on their side, these soldiers are more likely to be averse, they're more likely to descend into homelessness, alcoholism, and all of those things that are crippling to them on their side of the house. On our side, it's much more likely that a rational soldier who is not afflicted by PTSD is a better advocate. They didn't respond to the signal that the pills send, the fact that millions of people are taking them, and they didn't respond to the fact that whistleblowers still exist. This is crucial because their third speaker conceded that these whistleblowers feel a patriotic dedication to their country, right? So if the analysis that we gave you and they gave you is true, these whistleblowers will feel a patriotic dedication no matter what. So comparatively, we think that the media is better on our side, better advocacy comes from soldiers, better advocacy comes from the pills, and whistleblowers that exist on both sides. But finally, on medical treatment, right? They are the status quo, right? All of the problems that they talk about on their side still exist. We would say that trying to find the memory and like put a carpet over it isn't going to take away the memory. We take away the memory. That's why when we concentrate the aid, it's much better. Ultimately, Veterans Day comes one day a year. But for these people on their side of the house, it stays for their entire life. We say that it should not be so. They should have this choice. We were always so proud to propose.